A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers by Henry David Thoreau. Part 2. An essay, presented in 7 parts. First published in 1849. Part 2 of 7. Sunday. The river calmly flows, through shining banks, through lonely glen, where the owl shrieks, though ne'er the cheer of men has stirred its mute repose. Still if you should walk there, you would go there again. Channing. The Indians tell us of a beautiful river lying far to the south, which they call Merrimack. Sieur de Monts. Relations of the Jesuits. 1604. In the morning the river and adjacent country were covered with a dense fog, through which the smoke of our fire curled up like a still subtler mist. But before we had rowed many rods, the sun arose and the fog rapidly dispersed, leaving a slight steam only to curl along the surface of the water. It was a quiet Sunday morning, with more of the auroral rosy and white than of the yellow light in it, as if it dated from earlier than the fall of man, and still preserved a heathenish integrity. An early unconverted saint, free from noontide or evening taint, heathen without reproach, that did upon the civil day encroach, and ever since its birth, had trod the outskirts of the earth. But the impressions which the morning makes vanish with its dews, and not even the most persevering mortal can preserve the memory of its freshness to midday. As we passed the various islands, or what were islands in the spring, rowing with our backs downstream, we gave names to them. The one on which we had camped we called Fox Island, and one fine densely wooded island surrounded by deep water and overrun by grapevines, which looked like a mass of verdure and of flowers cast upon the waves, we named Grape Island. From Ball's Hill to Billerica Meeting House, the river was still twice as broad as in Concord, a deep, dark, and dead stream, flowing between gentle hills and sometimes cliffs, and well wooded all the way. It was a long woodland lake bordered with willows. For long reaches we could see neither house nor cultivated field, nor any sign of the vicinity of man. Now we coasted along some shallow shore by the edge of a dense palisade of bulrushes, which straightly bounded the water as if clipped by art, reminding us of the reed forts of the East Indians, of which we had read. And now the bank slightly raised was overhung with graceful grasses and various species of brake, whose downy stems stood closely grouped and naked as in a vase, while their heads spread several feet on either side. The dead limbs of the willow were rounded and adorned by the climbing Micanea scandens, which filled every crevice in the leafy bank, contrasting agreeably with the gray bark of its supporter and the balls of the button bush. The water willow, Salix persiana, when it is of large size and entire, is the most graceful and ethereal of our trees. Its masses of light green foliage, piled one upon another to the height of 20 or 30 feet, seemed to float on the surface of the water, while the slight gray stems and the shore were hardly visible between them. No tree is so wedded to the water, and harmonizes so well with still streams. It is even more graceful than the weeping willow, or any pendulous trees, which dip their branches in the stream instead of being buoyed up by it. Its limbs curved outward over the surface as if attracted by it. It had not a New England but an Oriental character, reminding us of trim Persian gardens, of Haroun al Raskid, and the artificial lakes of the East. As we thus dipped our way along between fresh masses of foliage overrun with the grape and smaller flowering vines, the surface was so calm, and both air and water so transparent, that the flight of a kingfisher or robin over the river was as distinctly seen reflected in the water below as in the air above. The birds seemed to flit through submerged groves, alighting on the yielding sprays, and their clear notes to come up from below. We were uncertain whether the water floated the land, or the land held the water in its bosom. It was such a season, in short, as that in which one of our Concord poets sailed on its stream, and sung its quiet glories. There is an inward voice, that in the stream, sends forth its spirit to the listening ear, and in a calm content it floweth on, Like wisdom, welcome with its own respect. Clear in its breast lie all these beauteous thoughts. It doth receive the green and graceful trees, and the grey rocks smile in its peaceful arms. And more he sung, but too serious for our page. For every oak and birch too growing on the hilltop, as well as for these elms and willows, we knew that there was a graceful ethereal and ideal tree making down from the roots. And sometimes nature in high tides brings her mirror to its foot and makes it visible. The stillness was intense and almost conscious, as if it were a natural Sabbath, and we fancied that the morning was the evening of a celestial day. The air was so elastic and crystalline that it had the same effect on the landscape that a glass has on a picture, to give it an ideal remoteness and perfection. The landscape was clothed in a mild and quiet light, in which the woods and fences checkered and partitioned it with new regularity, and rough and uneven fields stretched away with lawn-like smoothness to the horizon, and the clouds, finely distinct and picturesque, seemed a fit drapery to hang over fairyland. The world seemed decked for some holiday or prouder pageantry, with silken streamers flying, and the course of our lives to wind on before us like a green lane into a country maze, at the season when fruit trees are in blossom. Why should not our whole life and its scenery be actually thus fair and distinct? All our lives want a suitable background. They should at least, like the life of the anchorite, be as impressive to behold as objects in the desert, a broken shaft or crumbling mound against a limitless horizon. Character always secures for itself this advantage, and is thus distinct and unrelated to near or trivial objects, whether things or persons. On this same stream a maiden once sailed in my boat, thus unattended but by invisible guardians, and as she sat in the prow there was nothing but herself between the steersman and the sky. I could then say with the poet, "Sweet falls the summer air over her frame who sails with me. Her way like that is beautifully free, her nature far more rare, and is her constant heart of virgin purity." At evening still the very stars seem but this maiden's emissaries and reporters of her progress. Low in the eastern sky is set thy glancing eye, and though its gracious light ne'er riseth to my sight, yet every star that climbs above the gnarled limbs of yonder hill conveys thy gentle will. Believe I knew thy thought, and that the zephyrs brought thy kindest wishes through, as mine they bear to you, that some attentive cloud did pause amid the crowd over my head, while gentle things were said. Believe the thrushes sung, and that the flower bells rung, that herbs exhaled their scent, and beasts knew what was meant, the trees a welcome waved, and lakes their margins laved, when thy free mind to my retreat did wind. It was a summer eve, the air did gently heave, while yet a low-hung cloud thy eastern skies did shroud. The lightning's silent gleam, startling my drowsy dream, seemed like the flash under thy dark eyelash. Still will I strive to be as if thou wert with me. Whatever path I take, it shall be for thy sake, of gentle slope and wide, as thou wert by my side, without a root to trip thy gentle foot. I'll walk with gentle pace, and choose the smoothest place, and careful dip the oar, and shun the winding shore, and gently steer my boat where water lilies float, and cardinal flowers stand in their sylvan bowers. It required some rudeness to disturb with our boat the mirror-like surface of the water, in which every twig and blade of grass was so faithfully reflected. Too faithfully indeed for art to imitate, for only nature may exaggerate herself. The shallowest still water is unfathomable. Wherever the trees and skies are reflected, there is more than Atlantic depth, and no danger of fancy running aground. We notice that it required a separate intention of the eye, a more free and abstracted vision, to see the reflected trees and the sky, than to see the river bottom merely. And so are there manifold visions in the direction of every object, and even the most opaque reflect the heavens from their surface. Some men have their eyes naturally intended to the one and some to the other object. a man that looks on glass. On it may stay his eye. Or, if he pleaseth, through it pass. And the heavens espy. 2 men in a skiff, whom we passed hereabouts, floating buoyantly amid the reflections of the trees, like a feather in mid-air, or a leaf which is wafted gently from its twig to the water without turning over, seemed still in their element, and to have very delicately availed themselves of the natural laws. Their floating there was a beautiful and successful experiment in natural philosophy, and it served to ennoble in our eyes the art of navigation. For as birds fly and fishes swim, so these men sailed. It reminded us how much fairer and nobler all the actions of man might be, and that our life in its whole economy might be as beautiful as the fairest works of art or nature. The sun lodged on the old grey cliffs, and glanced from every pad. The bulrushes and flags seemed to rejoice in the delicious light and air. The meadows were drinking at their leisure. The frogs sat meditating, all Sabbath thoughts, summing up their week, with one eye out on the golden sun, and one toe upon a reed, eyeing the wondrous universe in which they act their part. The fishes swam more staid and soberly, as maidens go to church. Shoals of golden and silver minnows rose to the surface to behold the heavens, and then sheered off into more somber isles. They swept by as if moved by one mind, continually gliding past each other, and yet preserving the form of their battalion unchanged, as if they were still embraced by the transparent membrane which held the spawn. A young band of brethren and sisters trying their new fins. Now they wheeled, now shot ahead, and when we drove them to the shore and cut them off, they dexterously tacked and passed underneath the boat. Over the old wooden bridges no traveler crossed, and neither the river nor the fishes avoided to glide between the abutments. Here was a village not far off behind the woods, Billerica, settled not long ago, and the children still bear the names of the first settlers in this late, howling wilderness. Yet to all intents and purposes it is as old as Ferney or as Mantua, an old grey town where men grow old and sleep already under moss-grown monuments, outgrow their usefulness. This is ancient Billerica, Villarica, now in its dotage, named from the English Billericay, and whose Indian name was Shawshine. I never heard that it was young. See, is not nature here gone to decay? Farms all run out, meeting-house grown grey and racked with age? If you would know of its early youth, ask those old grey rocks in the pasture. It has a bell that sounds sometimes as far as Concord woods. I have heard that. I hear it now. No wonder that such a sound startled the dreaming Indian, and frightened his game, when the first bells were swung on trees, and sounded through the forest beyond the plantations of the white man. But today I like best the echo amid these cliffs and woods. It is no feeble imitation, but rather its original, or as if some rural Orpheus played over the strain again to show how it should sound. Dong, sounds the brass in the east, as if to a funeral feast, but I like that sound the best. Out of the fluttering west, the steeple ringeth a knell, but the fairies' silvery bell is the voice of that gentle folk, or else the horizon that spoke. Its metal is not of brass, but air, and water, and glass, and under a cloud it is swung, and by the wind it is rung. When the steeple tolleth the noon, it soundeth not so soon, yet it rings a far earlier hour, and the sun has not reached its tower. On the other hand, the road runs up to Carlisle, city of the woods, which, if it is less civil, is the more natural. It does well hold the earth together. It gets laughed at because it is a small town, I know, but nevertheless it is a place where great men may be born any day, for fair winds and foul blow right on over it without distinction. It has a meeting-house and horse sheds, a tavern and a blacksmith's shop, for centre, and a good deal of wood to cut and cord yet. And Bedford, most noble Bedford, I shall not thee forget. History has remembered thee, especially that meek and humble petition of thy old planters. like the wailing of the Lord's own people. To the gentlemen, the selectmen of Concord, praying to be erected into a separate parish. We can hardly credit that so plaintive a psalm resounded but little more than a century ago along these Babylonish waters. In the extreme difficult seasons of heat and cold, said they, we were ready to say of the Sabbath, behold what a weariness is it. Gentlemen, if our seeking to draw off proceed from any disaffection to our present reverend pastor, or the Christian society with whom we have taken such sweet counsel together, and walked unto the house of God in company, then hear us not this day, but we greatly desire, if God please, to be eased of our burden on the Sabbath, the travel and fatigue thereof, that the word of God may be nigh to us, near to our houses and in our hearts, that we and our little ones may serve the Lord. We hope that God, who stirred up the spirit of Cyrus to set forward temple work, has stirred us up to ask, and will stir you up to grant, the prayer of our petition. So shall your humble petitioners ever pray, as in duty bound. And so the temple work went forward here to a happy conclusion. Yonder in Carlisle the building of the temple was many wearisome years delayed, not that there was wanting of shittim wood, or the gold of Ophir, but a site therefore convenient to all the worshippers, whether on Buttrick's Plain, or rather on Poplar Hill. It was a tedious question. In this Billerica solid men must have lived, select from year to year, a series of town clerks, at least, and there are old records that you may search. Some spring the white man came, built him a house, and made a clearing here, letting in the sun, dried up a farm, piled up the old gray stones in fences, cut down the pines around his dwelling, planted orchard seeds brought from the old country, and persuaded the civil apple tree to blossom next to the wild pine and the juniper, shedding its perfume in the wilderness. Their old stocks still remain. He culled the graceful elm from out the woods and from the riverside, and so refined and smoothed his village plot. He rudely bridged the stream, and drove his team afield into the river meadows, cut the wild grass, and laid bare the homes of beaver, otter, muskrat, and with the whetting of his scythe scared off the deer and bear. He set up a mill, and fields of English grain sprang in the virgin soil. And with his grain he scattered the seeds of the dandelion and the wild trefoil over the meadows, mingling his English flowers with the wild native ones. The bristling burdock, the sweet-scented catnip, and the humble yarrow planted themselves along his woodland road, they too seeking freedom to worship God in their way. And thus he plants a town. The white man's mullen soon reigned in Indian cornfields, and sweet-scented English grasses clothed the new soil. Where, then, could the red man set his foot? The honey-bee hummed through the Massachusetts woods, and sipped the wildflowers round the Indian's wigwam, perchance unnoticed, when, with prophetic warning, it stung the red child's hand, forerunner of that industrious tribe that was to come and pluck the wildflower of his race up by the root. The white man comes, pale as the dawn, with a load of thought, with a slumbering intelligence as a fire raked up, knowing well what he knows, not guessing but calculating, strong in community, yielding obedience to authority, of experienced race, of wonderful, wonderful common sense, dull but capable, slow but persevering, severe but just, of little humor but genuine, a laboring man, despising game and sport, building a house that endures, a framed house. He buys the Indian's moccasins and baskets, then buys his hunting grounds, and at length forgets where he is buried and plows up his bones. And here town records, old, tattered, time-worn, weather-stained chronicles, contain the Indian sachem's mark perchance, an arrow or a beaver, and the few fatal words by which he deeded his hunting grounds away. He comes with a list of ancient Saxon, Norman, and Celtic names, and strews them up and down this river, Framingham, Sudbury, Bedford, Carlisle, Billerica, Chelmsford. And this is New Angleland. And these are the new West Saxons whom the red men call, not Anglish or English, but Yen geese. And so at last they are known for Yankees. When we were opposite to the middle of Billerica, the fields on either hand had a soft and cultivated English aspect, the village spire being seen over the copses which skirt the river, and sometimes an orchard straggled down to the waterside, though, generally, our course this forenoon was the wildest part of our voyage. It seemed that men led a quiet and very civil life there. The inhabitants were plainly cultivators of the earth, and lived under an organized political government. The schoolhouse stood with a meek aspect, entreating a long truce to war and savage life. Every one finds by his own experience, as well as in history, that the era in which men cultivate the apple, and the amenities of the garden, is essentially different from that of the hunter and forest life, and neither can displace the other without loss. We have all had our daydreams, as well as more prophetic nocturnal vision. But as for farming, I am convinced that my genius dates from an older era than the agricultural. I would at least strike my spade into the earth with such careless freedom but accuracy as the woodpecker his bill into a tree. There is in my nature, methinks, a singular yearning toward all wildness. I know of no redeeming qualities in myself but a sincere love for some things, and when I am reproved I fall back on to this ground. What have I to do with plows? I cut another furrow than you see. Where the off-ox treads, there is it not. It is farther off. Where the nigh ox walks, it will not be. It is nigher still. If corn fails, my crop fails not. And what are drought and rain to me? The rude Saxon pioneer will sometimes pine for that refinement and artificial beauty which are English, and love to hear the sound of such sweet and classical names as the Pentland and Malvern Hills, the cliffs of Dover and the Trossachs, Richmond, Derwent, and Windermere, which are to him now instead of the Acropolis and Parthenon, of Baiae, and Athens with its sea walls, and Arcadia and Tempe. Greece, who am I that should remember thee? Thy Marathon and thy Thermopylae? Is my life vulgar? My fate mean? Which on these golden memories can lean? We are apt enough to be pleased with such books as Evelyn Silva, Acetarium, and Calendarium Hortense, but they imply a relaxed nerve in the reader. Gardening is civil and social, but it wants the vigor and freedom of the forest and the outlaw. There may be an excess of cultivation as well as of anything else, until civilization becomes pathetic. A highly cultivated man, all whose bones can be bent, whose heaven-born virtues are but good manners. The young pines springing up in the cornfields from year to year are to me a refreshing fact. We talk of civilizing the Indian, but that is not the name for his improvement. By the wary independence and aloofness of his dim forest life he preserves his intercourse with his native gods, and is admitted from time to time to a rare and peculiar society with nature. He has glances of starry recognition to which our saloons are strangers. The steady illumination of his genius, dim only because distant, is like the faint but satisfying light of the stars compared with the dazzling but ineffectual and short-lived blaze of candles. The Society Islanders had their day-born gods, but they were not supposed to be of equal antiquity with the Achuafauaupa, or night-born gods. It is true, there are the innocent pleasures of country life, and it is sometimes pleasant to make the earth yield her increase, and gather the fruits in their season, but the heroic spirit will not fail to dream of remoter retirements and more rugged paths. It will have its garden plots and its parterres elsewhere than on the earth, and gather nuts and berries by the way for its subsistence, or orchard fruits with such heedlessness as berries. We would not always be soothing and taming nature, breaking the horse and the ox, but sometimes ride the horse wild and chase the buffalo. The Indian's intercourse with nature is at least such as admits of the greatest independence of each. If he is somewhat of a stranger in her midst, the gardener is too much of a familiar. There is something vulgar and foul in the latter's closeness to his mistress, something noble and cleanly in the former's distance. In civilization, As in a southern latitude, man degenerates at length, and yields to the incursion of more northern tribes. Some nation yet shut in with hills of ice. There are other, savager, and more primeval aspects of nature than our poets have sung. It is only white man's poetry. Homer and Ossian even can never revive in London or Boston. And yet behold how these cities are refreshed by the mere tradition, or the imperfectly transmitted fragrance and flavor of these wild fruits. If we could listen but for an instant to the chant of the Indian muse, we should understand why he will not exchange his savageness for civilization. Nations are not whimsical. Steel and blankets are strong temptations. But the Indian does well to continue Indian. After sitting in my chamber many days, reading the poets, I have been out early on a foggy morning, and heard the cry of an owl in a neighboring wood as from a nature behind the common, unexplored by science or by literature. None of the feathered race has yet realized my youthful conceptions of the woodland depths. I had seen the red election bird brought from their recesses on my comrade's string, and fancied that their plumage would assume stranger and more dazzling colors, like the tints of evening, in proportion as I advanced farther into the darkness and solitude of the forest. Still less have I seen such strong and wilderness tints on any poet's string. These modern ingenious sciences and arts do not affect me as those more venerable arts of hunting and fishing, and even of husbandry in its primitive and simple form. As ancient and honorable trades as the sun and moon and winds pursue, coeval with the faculties of man, and invented when these were invented. We do not know their John Gutenberg, or Richard Arkwright, though the poets would fain make them to have been gradually learned and taught. According to Gower, and Iadahel, as Seth the Boak first made Nettie, and fishes Tokay. Of hunting eke he fawned the chase, which now is no in many place. A tent of cloth, with cord and stake, he set up first, and did it make. Also, Lydgate says, Jason first sailed, in story it is tolda, toward Colchos, to win the fleece of gold. Ceres the goddess fond first the tilde of land. Also, Aristeus fond first the usage of milk, and crudis, and of honey swote. Periodes, for Greta avantage, from flint smote fire, daring in the root. We read that Aristeus obtained of Jupiter and Neptune, that the pestilential heat of the dog days, wherein was great mortality, should be mitigated with wind. This is one of those dateless benefits conferred on man, which have no record in our vulgar day, though we still find some similitude to them in our dreams, in which we have a more liberal and juster apprehension of things, unconstrained by habit, which is then in some measure put off, and divested of memory, which we call history. According to fable, when the island of Aegina was depopulated by sickness, at the instance of Aeacus, Jupiter turned the ants into men, that is, as some think, he made men of the inhabitants who lived meanly like ants. This is perhaps the fullest history of those early days extant. The fable which is naturally and truly composed, so as to satisfy the imagination, ere it addresses the understanding, beautiful though strange as a wild flower, is to the wise man an apothegm, and admits of his most generous interpretation. When we read that Bacchus made the Tyrrhenian mariners mad, so that they leapt into the sea, mistaking it for a meadow full of flowers, and so became dolphins, we are not concerned about the historical truth of this, but rather a higher poetical truth. We seem to hear the music of a thought, and care not if the understanding be not gratified. For their beauty, consider the fables of Narcissus, of Endymion, of Memnon son of morning, the representative of all promising youths who have died a premature death, and whose memory is melodiously prolonged to the latest morning. The beautiful stories of Phaeton, and of the sirens whose hull shone afar off white with the bones of unburied men, and the pregnant ones of Pan, Prometheus, and the Sphinx, and that long list of names which have already become part of the universal language of civilized men. and from proper are becoming common names or nouns. The Sibyls, the Eumenides, the Parsi, the Graces, the Muses, Nemesis, etc. It is interesting to observe with what singular unanimity the farthest sundered nations and generations consent to give completeness and roundness to an ancient fable, of which they indistinctly appreciate the beauty or the truth. By a faint and dreamlike effort, though it be only by the vote of a scientific body, the dullest posterity slowly adds some trait to the mythos. As when astronomers call the lately discovered planet Neptune, or the asteroid Astrea, that the Virgin who was driven from earth to heaven at the end of the Golden Age, may have her local habitation in the heavens more distinctly assigned her, for the slightest recognition of poetic worth is significant. By such slow aggregation has mythology grown from the first. The very nursery tales of this generation, were the nursery tales of primeval races. They migrate from east to west, and again from west to east. Now expanded into the tale divine of bards, now shrunk into a popular rhyme. This is an approach to that universal language which men have sought in vain. This fond reiteration of the oldest expressions of truth by the latest posterity, content with slightly and religiously retouching the old material, is the most impressive proof of a common humanity. All nations love the same jests and tales, Jews, Christians, and Mahometans, and the same translated suffice for all. All men are children, and of one family. The same tale sends them all to bed, and wakes them in the morning. Joseph Wolfe, the missionary, distributed copies of Robinson Crusoe, translated into Arabic, among the Arabs, and they made a great sensation. Robinson Crusoe's adventures and wisdom, says he, were read by Mahometans in the marketplaces of Sana'a, Hodeidah, and Lohia, and admired and believed. On reading the book, the Arabians exclaimed, "Oh, that Robinson Crusoe must have been a great prophet." To some extent, mythology is only the most ancient history and biography. So far from being false or fabulous in the common sense, it contains only enduring and essential truth, the I and you, the here and there, the now and then, being omitted. Either time or rare wisdom writes it. Before printing was discovered, a century was equal to 1,000 years. The poet is he who can write some pure mythology today without the aid of posterity. In how few words? For instance, the Greeks would have told the story of Abelard and Heloise, making but a sentence for our classical dictionary, and then, perchance, have stuck up their names to shine in some corner of the firmament. We moderns, on the other hand, collect only the raw materials of biography and history, memoirs to serve for a history, which itself is but materials to serve for a mythology. How many volumes folio would the life and labors of Prometheus have filled, if perchance it had fallen, as perchance it did first, in days of cheap printing? Who knows what shape the fable of Columbus will at length assume, to be confounded with that of Jason and the expedition of the Argonauts. And Franklin, there may be a line for him in the future classical dictionary, recording what that demigod did, and referring him to some new genealogy. Son of An. He aided the Americans to gain their independence, instructed mankind in economy, and drew down lightning from the clouds. The hidden significance of these fables, which is sometimes thought to have been detected, the ethics running parallel to the poetry and history, are not so remarkable as the readiness with which they may be made to express a variety of truths. As if they were the skeletons of still older and more universal truths than any whose flesh and blood they are for the time made to wear. It is like striving to make the sun, or the wind, or the sea symbols to signify exclusively the particular thoughts of our day. But what signifies it? In the mythos, a superhuman intelligence uses the unconscious thoughts and dreams of men as its hieroglyphics to address men unborn. In the history of the human mind, these glowing and ruddy fables precede the noonday thoughts of men, as aurora the sun's rays. The matutine intellect of the poet, keeping in advance of the glare of philosophy, always dwells in this auroral atmosphere. As we said before, the Concord is a dead stream, but its scenery is the more suggestive to the contemplative voyager, and this day its water was fuller of reflections than our pages even. Just before it reaches the falls in Billerica, it is contracted, and becomes swifter and shallower, with a yellow pebbly bottom, hardly passable for a canal boat, leaving the broader and more stagnant portion above like a lake among the hills. All through the Concord, Bedford, and Billerica meadows we had heard no murmur from its stream, except where some tributary runnel tumbled in, some tumultuous little rill, purling round its storied pebble, tinkling to the selfsame tune, from September until June, which no drought doth e'er enfeeble. Silent flows the parent stream, and if rocks do lie below, smothers with her waves the din, as it were a youthful sin, just as still, and just as slow. But now at length we heard this staid and primitive river rushing to her fall, like any rill. We here left its channel, just above the Billerica Falls, and entered the canal, which runs, or rather is conducted, 6 miles through the woods to the Merrimack, at Middlesex, and as we did not care to loiter in this part of our voyage, while one ran along the towpath drawing the boat by a cord, the other kept it off the shore with a pole, so that we accomplished the whole distance in little more than an hour. This canal, which is the oldest in the country, and has even an antique look beside the more modern railroads, is fed by the Concord, so that we were still floating on its familiar waters. It is so much water which the river lets for the advantage of commerce. There appeared some want of harmony in its scenery, since it was not of equal date with the woods and meadows through which it is led, and we missed the conciliatory influence of time on land and water. But in the lapse of ages, nature will recover and indemnify herself, and gradually plant fit shrubs and flowers along its borders. Already the kingfisher sat upon a pine over the water, and the bream and pickerel swam below. Thus all works pass directly out of the hands of the architect into the hands of nature, to be perfected. It was a retired and pleasant route, without houses or travelers, except some young men who were lounging upon a bridge in Chelmsford, who leaned impudently over the rails to pry into our concerns, but we caught the eye of the most forward, and looked at him till he was visibly discomfited. Not that there was any peculiar efficacy in our look, but rather a sense of shame left in him which disarmed him. It is a very true and expressive phrase. He looked daggers at me, for the first pattern and prototype of all daggers must have been a glance of the eye. First, there was the glance of Jove's eye, then his fiery bolt, then, the material gradually hardening, tridents, spears, javelins, and finally, for the convenience of private men, daggers, krisses, and so forth, were invented. It is wonderful how we get about the streets without being wounded by these delicate and glancing weapons. A man can so nimbly whip out his rapier, or without being noticed carry it unsheathed. Yet it is rare that one gets seriously looked at. As we passed under the last bridge over the canal, just before reaching the Merrimack, the people coming out of church paused to look at us from above, and apparently, so strong is custom, indulged in some heathenish comparisons. But we were the truest observers of this sunny day. According to Hesiod, the 7th is a holy day, for then Latona brought forth golden-rayed Apollo, and by our reckoning this was the 7th day of the week, and not the 1st. I find among the papers of an old justice of the peace and deacon of the town of Concord, this singular memorandum, which is worth preserving as a relic of an ancient custom. After reforming the spelling and grammar, it runs as follows. Men that traveled with teams on the Sabbath, December 18th, 1803, were Jeremiah Richardson and Jonas Parker, both of Shirley. They had teams with rigging such as is used to carry barrels, and they were traveling westward. Richardson was questioned by the Honorable Ephraim Wood, Esquire, and he said that Jonas Parker was his fellow traveler, and he further said that a Mr. Longley was his employer, who promised to bear him out. We were the men that were gliding northward, this September 1st, 1839, with still team, and rigging not the most convenient to carry barrels, unquestioned by any squire or church deacon, and ready to bear ourselves out if need were. In the latter part of the 17th century, according to the historian of Dunstable, towns were directed to erect a cage near the meeting house, and in this all offenders against the sanctity of the Sabbath were confined. Society has relaxed a little from its strictness, one would say, but I presume that there is not less religion than formerly. If the ligature is found to be loosened in one part, it is only drawn the tighter in another. You can hardly convince a man of an error in a lifetime, but must content yourself with the reflection that the progress of science is slow. If he is not convinced, his grandchildren may be. The geologists tell us that it took 100 years to prove that fossils are organic, and 150 more to prove that they are not to be referred to the Noachian deluge. I am not sure, but I should betake myself in extremities to the liberal divinities of Greece, rather than to my country's God. Jehovah, though with us he has acquired new attributes, is more absolute and unapproachable, but hardly more divine, than Jove. He is not so much of a gentleman, not so gracious and catholic. He does not exert so intimate and genial an influence on nature, as many a god of the Greeks. I should fear the infinite power and inflexible justice of the almighty mortal, hardly as yet apotheosized, so wholly masculine, with no sister Juno, no Apollo, no Venus, nor Minerva, to intercede for me. Theta upsilon mu phi iota lambda omicron upsilon sigma tau epsilon, kappa eta delta omicron mu nu eta tau epsilon. The Grecian are youthful and erring and fallen gods, with the vices of men, but in many important respects essentially of the divine race. In my pantheon, Pan still reigns in his pristine glory, with his ruddy face, his flowing beard, and his shaggy body, his pipe and his crook, his nymph Echo, and his chosen daughter Iambe. For the great god Pan is not dead, as was rumored. No god ever dies. Perhaps of all the gods of New England and of ancient Greece, I am most constant at his shrine. It seems to me that the god that is commonly worshipped in civilized countries is not at all divine, though he bears a divine name, but is the overwhelming authority and respectability of mankind combined. Men reverence one another, not yet God. If I thought that I could speak with discrimination and impartiality of the nations of Christendom, I should praise them, but it tasks me too much. They seem to be the most civil and humane, but I may be mistaken. Every people have gods to suit their circumstances. The Society Islanders had a god called Toahitu, in shape like a dog. He saved such as were in danger of falling from rocks and trees. I think that we can do without him, as we have not much climbing to do. Among them a man could make himself a god out of a piece of wood in a few minutes, which would frighten him out of his wits. I fancy that some indefatigable spinster of the old school, who had the supreme felicity to be born in days that tried men's souls, hearing this, may say with Nestor, another of the old school, but you are younger than I. For time was when I conversed with greater men than you. For not at any time have I seen such men, nor shall see them, as Parathus, and Dryas, and Pi Omicron iota mu nu alpha lambda alpha nu, that is probably Washington, sole shepherd of the people. And when Apollo has now 6 times rolled westward, or seemed to roll, and now for the 7th time shows his face in the east, eyes well nigh glazed, long glassed, which have fluctuated only between lamb's wool and worsted, explore ceaselessly some good sermon book. For 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy knitting, but on the 7th, forsooth, thy reading. Happy we who can bask in this warm September sun, which illumines all creatures, as well when they rest as when they toil, not without a feeling of gratitude. Whose life is as blameless, how blameworthy soever it may be, on the Lord's Monaday as on his Sunaday. There are various, Nay, incredible faiths. Why should we be alarmed at any of them? What man believes, God believes. Long as I have lived, and many blasphemers as I have heard and seen, I have never yet heard or witnessed any direct and conscious blasphemy or irreverence. But of indirect and habitual, enough. Where is the man who is guilty of direct and personal insolence to him that made him? One memorable addition to the old mythology is due to this era: the Christian fable. With what pains, and tears, and blood these centuries have woven this and added it to the mythology of mankind. The new Prometheus. With what miraculous consent, and patience, and persistency has this mythus been stamped on the memory of the race. It would seem as if it were in the progress of our mythology to dethrone Jehovah, and crown Christ in his stead. If it is not a tragical life we live, then I know not what to call it. Such a story as that of Jesus Christ, the history of Jerusalem, say, being a part of the universal history. The naked, the embalmed, unburied death of Jerusalem amid its desolate hills, think of it. In Tasso's poem I trust some things are sweetly buried. Consider the snappish tenacity with which they preach Christianity still. What are time and space to Christianity? 1800 years. And a new world? That the humble life of a Jewish peasant should have forced to make a New York bishop so bigoted. 44 lamps. The gift of kings. Now burning in a place called the Holy Sepulchre, a church bell ringing, some unaffected tears shed by a pilgrim on Mount Calvary within the week. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, when I forget thee, may my right hand forget her cunning. By the waters of Babylon there we sat down, and we wept when we remembered Zion. I trust that some may be as near and dear to Buddha, or Christ, or Swedenborg, who are without the pale of their churches. It is necessary not to be Christian to appreciate the beauty and significance of the life of Christ. I know that some will have hard thoughts of me, when they hear their Christ named beside my Buddha, yet I am sure that I am willing they should love their Christ more than my Buddha. For the love is the main thing, and I like him too. God is the letter Ku, as well as Ku. Why need Christians be still intolerant and superstitious? The simple-minded sailors were unwilling to cast overboard Jonah at his own request. Where is this love become in later age? Alas! 'Tis gone in endless pilgrimage. From hence, and never to return, I doubt, till revolution will those times about. One man says, the world's a popular disease, that reigns within the froward heart and frantic brains of poor distempered mortals. Another, that all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. The world is a strange place for a playhouse to stand within it. Old Drayton thought that a man that lived here, and would be a poet, for instance, should have in him certain brave, translunary things, and a fine madness should possess his brain. Certainly it were as well that he might be up to the occasion. That is a superfluous wonder, which Dr. Johnson expresses at the assertion of Sir Thomas Browne that his life has been a miracle of 30 years, which to relate were not history but a piece of poetry, and would sound like a fable. The wonder is, rather, that all men do not assert as much. That would be a rare praise, if it were true, which was addressed to Francis Beaumont. Spectators, take part in your tragedies. Think what a mean and wretched place this world is. That half the time we have to light a lamp that we may see to live in it. This is half our life. Who would undertake the enterprise if it were all? And, pray, what more has day to offer? A lamp that burns more clear, a purer oil, say winter strained, that so we may pursue our idleness with less obstruction. Bribed with a little sunlight and a few prismatic tints, we bless our Maker, and stave off his wrath with hymns. I make ye an offer, ye gods, hear the scoffer. The scheme will not hurt you. If ye will find goodness, I will find virtue. Though I am your creature, and child of your nature, I have pride still unbended, and blood undescended. some free independence, and my own descendants. I cannot toil blindly, though ye behave kindly, and I swear by the rood, I'll be slave to no God. If ye will deal plainly, I will strive mainly, if ye will discover great plans to your lover, and give him a sphere somewhat larger than here. Verily, my angels, I was abashed on account of my servant, who had no providence but me. Therefore did I pardon him. The Gulistan of Suddy. Most people with whom I talk, men and women even of some originality and genius, have their scheme of the universe all cut and dried, very dry, I assure you, to hear, dry enough to burn, dry-rotted and powder-post, methinks, which they set up between you and them in the shortest intercourse. An ancient and tottering frame with all its boards blown off. They do not walk without their bed. Some, to me, seemingly very unimportant and unsubstantial things and relations, are for them everlastingly settled, as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and the like. These are like the everlasting hills to them. But in all my wanderings I never came across the least vestige of authority for these things. They have not left so distinct a trace as the delicate flower of a remote geological period on the coal in my grate. The wisest man preaches no doctrines. He has no scheme. He sees no rafter, not even a cobweb, against the heavens. It is clear sky. If I ever see more clearly at one time than at another, the medium through which I see is clearer. To see from earth to heaven, and see there standing, still a fixture, that old Jewish scheme. What right have you to hold up this obstacle to my understanding you, to your understanding me? You did not invent it. It was imposed on you. Examine your authority. Even Christ, we fear, had his scheme, his conformity to tradition, which slightly vitiates his teaching. He had not swallowed all formulas. He preached some mere doctrines. As for me, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are now only the subtlest imaginable essences, which would not stain the morning sky. Your scheme must be the framework of the universe. All other schemes will soon be ruins. The perfect God in his revelations of himself has never got to the length of one such proposition as you, his prophets, state. Have you learned the alphabet of heaven and can count 3? Do you know the number of God's family? Can you put mysteries into words? Do you presume to fable of the ineffable? Pray, what geographer are you, that speak of heaven's topography? Whose friend are you that speak of God's personality? Do you, Miles Howard, think that he has made you his confidant? Tell me of the height of the mountains of the moon, or of the diameter of space, and I may believe you, but of the secret history of the Almighty, and I shall pronounce thee mad. Yet we have a sort of family history of our God, so have the Tahitians of theirs, and some old poet's grand imagination is imposed on us as adamantine everlasting truth, and God's own word. Pythagoras says, truly enough, a true assertion respecting God is an assertion of God. But we may well doubt if there is any example of this in literature. The New Testament is an invaluable book, though I confess to having been slightly prejudiced against it in my very early days by the church and the Sabbath school, so that it seemed, before I read it, to be the yellowest book in the catalogue. Yet I early escaped from their meshes. It was hard to get the commentaries out of one's head and taste its true flavor. I think that Pilgrim's Progress is the best sermon which has been preached from this text. Almost all other sermons that I have heard, or heard of, have been but poor imitations of this. It would be a poor story to be prejudiced against the life of Christ because the book has been edited by Christians. In fact, I love this book rarely, though it is a sort of castle in the air to me, which I am permitted to dream. Having come to it so recently and freshly, it has the greater charm, so that I cannot find any to talk with about it. I never read a novel. They have so little real life and thought in them. The reading which I love best is the scriptures of the several nations, though it happens that I am better acquainted with those of the Hindus, the Chinese, and the Persians, than of the Hebrews, which I have come to last. Give me one of these Bibles and you have silenced me for a while. When I recover the use of my tongue, I am wont to worry my neighbors with the new sentences. But commonly they cannot see that there is any wit in them. Such has been my experience with the New Testament. I have not yet got to the crucifixion. I have read it over so many times. I should love dearly to read it aloud to my friends, some of whom are seriously inclined. It is so good, and I am sure that they have never heard it. It fits their case exactly, and we should enjoy it so much together, but I instinctively despair of getting their ears. They soon show, by signs not to be mistaken, that it is inexpressibly wearisome to them. I do not mean to imply that I am any better than my neighbors. For, alas, I know that I am only as good, though I love better books than they. It is remarkable that, notwithstanding the universal favor with which the New Testament is outwardly received, and even the bigotry with which it is defended, there is no hospitality shown to, there is no appreciation of, the order of truth with which it deals. I know of no book that has so few readers. There is none so truly strange, and heretical, and unpopular. To Christians, no less than Greeks and Jews, it is foolishness and a stumbling block. There are, indeed, severe things in it which no man should read aloud more than once. Seek first the kingdom of heaven. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth. If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. For what is a man profited, if he shall gain the whole world, and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Think of this, Yankees. Verily, I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place. And it shall remove. And nothing shall be impossible unto you. Think of repeating these things to a New England audience. Thirdly, fourthly, 15thly, till there are 3 barrels of sermons. Who, without cant, can read them aloud? Who, without cant, can hear them, and not go out of the meeting house? They never were read. They never were heard. Let but one of these sentences be rightly read, from any pulpit in the land, and there would not be left one stone of that meeting house upon another. Yet the New Testament treats of man and man's so-called spiritual affairs too exclusively, and is too constantly moral and personal, to alone content me, who am not interested solely in man's religious or moral nature, or in man even. I have not the most definite designs on the future. Absolutely speaking, do unto others as you would that they should do unto you, is by no means a golden rule, but the best of current silver. An honest man would have but little occasion for it. It is golden not to have any rule at all in such a case. The book has never been written which is to be accepted without any allowance. Christ was a sublime actor on the stage of the world. He knew what he was thinking of when he said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." I draw near to him at such a time. Yet he taught mankind but imperfectly how to live. His thoughts were all directed toward another world. There is another kind of success than his. Even here we have a sort of living to get, and must buffet it somewhat longer. There are various tough problems yet to solve, and we must make shift to live, betwixt spirit and matter, such a human life as we can. A healthy man, with steady employment, as wood chopping at 50 cents a cord, and a camp in the woods, will not be a good subject for Christianity. The New Testament may be a choice book to him on some, but not on all or most of his days. He will rather go a-fishing in his leisure hours. The apostles, though they were fishers too, were of the solemn race of sea fishers, and never trolled for pickerel on inland streams. Men have a singular desire to be good without being good for anything. because, perchance, they think vaguely that so it will be good for them in the end. The sort of morality which the priests inculcate is a very subtle policy, far finer than the politicians, and the world is very successfully ruled by them as the policeman. It is not worth the while to let our imperfections disturb us always. The conscience really does not, and ought not to monopolize the whole of our lives, any more than the heart or the head. It is as liable to disease as any other part. I have seen some whose consciences, owing undoubtedly to former indulgence, had grown to be as irritable as spoilt children, and at length gave them no peace. They did not know when to swallow their cud, and their lives of course yielded no milk. Conscience is instinct bred in the house. Feeling and thinking propagate the sin by an unnatural breeding in and in. I say, turn it outdoors, into the moors. I love a life whose plot is simple, and does not thicken with every pimple. A soul so sound no sickly conscience binds it. That makes the universe no worse than T finds it. I love an earnest soul, whose mighty joy and sorrow are not drowned in a bowl, and brought to life tomorrow. That lives one tragedy, and not 70. A conscience worth keeping, laughing not weeping. A conscience wise and steady, and forever ready, not changing with events, dealing in compliments. A conscience exercised about large things, where one may doubt. I love a soul not all of wood, predestinated to be good, but true to the backbone, unto itself alone, and false to none, born to its own affairs, its own joys and own cares, by whom the work which God begun is finished, and not undone, taken up where he left off, whether to worship or to scoff. If not good, why then evil? If not good God, good devil, goodness. You hypocrite, come out of that. Live your life. Do your work. Then take your hat. I have no patience towards such conscientious cowards. Give me simple laboring folk, who love their work, whose virtue is a song, to cheer God along. I was once reproved by a minister who was driving a poor beast to some meeting-house horse sheds among the hills of New Hampshire, because I was bending my steps to a mountain-top on the Sabbath, instead of a church, when I would have gone farther than he to hear a true word spoken on that or any day. He declared that I was breaking the Lord's fourth commandment, and proceeded to enumerate, in a sepulchral tone, the disasters which had befallen him whenever he had done any ordinary work on the Sabbath. He really thought that a God was on the watch to trip up those men who followed any secular work on this day, and did not see that it was the evil conscience of the workers that did it. The country is full of this superstition, so that when one enters a village, the church, not only really but from association, is the ugliest looking building in it, because it is the one in which human nature stoops the lowest and is most disgraced. Certainly, such temples as these shall ere long cease to deform the landscape. There are few things more disheartening and disgusting than when you are walking the streets of a strange village on the Sabbath, to hear a preacher shouting like a boatswain in a gale of wind, and thus harshly profaning the quiet atmosphere of the day. You fancy him to have taken off his coat, as when men are about to do hot and dirty work. If I should ask the minister of Middlesex to let me speak in his pulpit on a Sunday, he would object, because I do not pray as he does, or because I am not ordained. What under the sun are these things? Really, there is no infidelity, nowadays, so great as that which prays, and keeps the Sabbath, and rebuilds the churches. The sealer of the South Pacific preaches a truer doctrine. The church is a sort of hospital for men's souls, and as full of quackery as the hospital for their bodies. Those who are taken into it live like pensioners in their retreat or sailors' sung harbor, where you may see a row of religious cripples sitting outside in sunny weather. Let not the apprehension that he may one day have to occupy a ward therein discourage the cheerful labors of the able-souled man. While he remembers the sick in their extremities, let him not look thither as to his goal. One is sick at heart of this pagoda worship. It is like the beating of gongs in a Hindu subterranean temple. In dark places and dungeons the preacher's words might perhaps strike root and grow, but not in broad daylight in any part of the world that I know. The sound of the Sabbath bell far away, now breaking on these shores, does not awaken pleasing associations, but melancholy and somber ones rather. One involuntarily rests on his oar, to humor his unusually meditative mood. It is as the sound of many catechisms and religious books twanging a canting peal round the earth, seeming to issue from some Egyptian temple and echo along the shore of the Nile, right opposite to Pharaoh's palace and Moses in the bulrushes, startling a multitude of storks and alligators basking in the sun. Everywhere, good men sound a retreat, and the word has gone forth to fall back on innocence. Fall forward rather on to whatever there is there. Christianity only hopes. It has hung its harp on the willows, and cannot sing a song in a strange land. It has dreamed a sad dream, and does not yet welcome the morning with joy. The mother tells her falsehoods to her child, but, thank heaven, the child does not grow up in its parent's shadow. Our mother's faith has not grown with her experience. Her experience has been too much for her. The lesson of life was too hard for her to learn. It is remarkable that almost all speakers and writers feel it to be incumbent on them, sooner or later, to prove or to acknowledge the personality of God. Some Earl of Bridgewater, thinking it better late than never, has provided for it in his will. It is a sad mistake. In reading a work on agriculture, we have to skip the author's moral reflections, and the words, providence, and heat scattered along the page, to come at the profitable level of what he has to say. What he calls his religion is for the most part offensive to the nostrils. He should know better than expose himself, and keep his foul sores covered till they are quite healed. There is more religion in men's science than there is science in their religion. Let us make haste to the report of the Committee on Swine. A man's real faith is never contained in his creed, nor is his creed an article of his faith. The last is never adopted. This it is that permits him to smile ever, and to live even as bravely as he does. And yet he clings anxiously to his creed, as to a straw, thinking that that does him good service because his sheet anchor does not drag. In most men's religion, the ligature, which should be its umbilical cord connecting them with divinity, is rather like that thread which the accomplices of Cylon held in their hands when they went abroad from the temple of Minerva, the other end being attached to the statue of the goddess. But frequently, as in their case, the thread breaks, being stretched, and they are left without an asylum. A good and pious man reclined his head on the bosom of contemplation, and was absorbed in the ocean of a reverie. At the instant when he awaked from his vision, one of his friends, by way of pleasantry, said, "What rare gift have you brought us from that garden, where you have been recreating?" He replied, "I fancied to myself and said, when I can reach the rose bower, I will fill my lap with the flowers, and bring them as a present to my friends. But when I got there, the fragrance of the roses so intoxicated me, that the skirt dropped from my hands. O bird of dawn! Learn the warmth of affection from the moth. For that scorched creature gave up the ghost, and uttered not a groan. These vain pretenders are ignorant of him they seek after. For of him that knew him we never heard again. O thou, who towerest above the flights of conjecture, opinion, and comprehension, whatever has been reported of thee we have heard and read. The congregation is dismissed, and life drawn to a close, and we still rest at our first encomium of thee. Sutty. By noon we were let down into the Merrimack through the locks at Middlesex, just above Pawtucket Falls, by a serene and liberal-minded man, who came quietly from his book, though his duties, we supposed, did not require him to open the locks on Sundays. With him we had a just and equal encounter of the eyes, as between two honest men. The movements of the eyes express the perpetual and unconscious courtesy of the parties. It is said that a rogue does not look you in the face, Neither does an honest man look at you as if he had his reputation to establish. I have seen some who did not know when to turn aside their eyes in meeting yours. A truly confident and magnanimous spirit is wiser than to contend for the mastery in such encounters. Serpents alone conquer by the steadiness of their gaze. My friend looks me in the face and sees me. That is all. The best relations were at once established between us and this man, and though few words were spoken, he could not conceal a visible interest in us and our excursion. He was a lover of the higher mathematics, as we found, and in the midst of some vast sunny problem, when we overtook him and whispered our conjectures. By this man we were presented with the freedom of the Merrimack. We now felt as if we were fairly launched on the ocean stream of our voyage, and were pleased to find that our boat would float on Merrimack water. We began again busily to put in practice those old arts of rowing, steering, and paddling. It seemed a strange phenomenon to us that the two rivers should mingle their waters so readily, since we had never associated them in our thoughts. As we glided over the broad bosom of the Merrimack, between Chelmsford and Dracut, at noon, here a quarter of a mile wide, the rattling of our oars was echoed over the water to those villages, and their slight sounds to us. Their harbors lay as smooth and fairy-like as the Lido, or Syracuse, or Rhodes, in our imagination, while, like some strange roving craft, we flitted past what seemed the dwellings of noble homestaying men, seemingly as conspicuous as if on an eminence, or floating upon a tide which came up to those villagers' breasts. At a third of a mile over the water we heard distinctly some children repeating their catechism in a cottage near the shore, while in the broad shallows between, a herd of cows stood lashing their sides, and waging war with the flies. 200 years ago other catechizing than this was going on here. For here came the sachem Wanalancet, and his people, and sometimes Tahattawan, our Concord sachem, who afterwards had a church at home, to catch fish at the falls. And here also came John Eliot, with the Bible and Catechism, and Baxter's Call to the Unconverted, and other tracts, done into the Massachusetts tongue, and taught them Christianity meanwhile. This place, says Gookin, referring to Wamasett, being an ancient and capital seat of Indians, they come to fish. And this good man takes this opportunity to spread the net of the gospel, to fish for their souls. May 5, 1674. He continues. According to our usual custom, Mr. Eliot and myself took our journey to Wamasett, or Pawtucket. And arriving there that evening, Mr. Eliot preached to as many of them as could be got together, out of Matthew 22, 1-14, the parable of the marriage of the king's son. We met at the wigwam of one called Wanalancet, about 2 miles from the town, near Pawtucket Falls, and bordering upon Merrimack River. This person, Wanalancet, is the eldest son of old Passaconaway, the chiefest sachem of Pawtucket. He is a sober and grave person, and of years, between 50 and 60. He hath been always loving and friendly to the English. As yet, however, they had not prevailed on him to embrace the Christian religion. But at this time, says Gookin, May 6, 1674, after some deliberation and serious pause, he stood up, and made a speech to this effect. I must acknowledge I have, all my days, used to pass in an old canoe, alluding to his frequent custom to pass in a canoe upon the river. And now you exhort me to change and leave my old canoe, and embark in a new canoe, to which I have hitherto been unwilling. But now I yield up myself to your advice, and enter into a new canoe, and do engage to pray to God hereafter. 1. Mr. Richard Daniel, a gentleman that lived in Billerica, who with other persons of quality was present, desired Brother Eliot to tell the sachem from him, that it may be, while he went in his old canoe, he passed in a quiet stream. But the end thereof was death and destruction to soul and body. But now he went into a new canoe. Perhaps he would meet with storms and trials. but yet he should be encouraged to persevere. For the end of his voyage would be everlasting rest. Since that time, I hear this sachem doth persevere, and is a constant and diligent hearer of God's word, and sanctifieth the Sabbath, though he doth travel to Wamasett meeting every Sabbath, which is above 2 miles. And though sundry of his people have deserted him, since he subjected to the gospel, yet he continues and persists. Gookin's Historical Collections of the Indians in New England, 1674. Already, as appears from the records, at a general court held at Boston in New England, the 7th of the first month, 1643-4, Wassamequin, Nashunan, Cuchamaquin, Massacanamet, and Squaw Sachem, did voluntarily submit themselves to the English. And among other things did promise to be willing from time to time to be instructed in the knowledge of God. Being asked not to do any unnecessary work on the Sabbath day, especially within the gates of Christian towns, they answered, "It is easy to them. They have not much to do on any day, and they can well take their rest on that day." So, says Winthrop, in his journal, we causing them to understand the articles, and all the 10 commandments of God, and they freely assenting to all, they were solemnly received, and then presented the court with 26 fathom more of wampum. And the court gave each of them a coat of 2 yards of cloth, and their dinner, and to them and their men, every of them, a cup of sack at their departure. So they took leave and went away. What journeyings on foot and on horseback through the wilderness, to preach the gospel to these minks and muskrats, who first, no doubt, listened with their red ears out of a natural hospitality and courtesy, and afterward from curiosity or even interest, till at length there were praying Indians. And, as the General Court wrote to Cromwell, the work is brought to this perfection, that some of the Indians themselves can pray and prophesy in a comfortable manner. It was in fact an old battle and hunting ground through which we had been floating, the ancient dwelling place of a race of hunters and warriors. Their weirs of stone, their arrowheads and hatchets, their pestles, and the mortars in which they pounded Indian corn before the white man had tasted it, lay concealed in the mud of the river bottom. Tradition still points out the spots where they took fish in the greatest numbers, by such arts as they possessed. It is a rapid story the historian will have to put together. Myantonimo, Winthrop, Webster. Soon he comes from Montauk to Bunker Hill, from bear skins, parched corn, bows and arrows, to tiled roofs, wheat fields, guns and swords. Pawtucket and Wamasett, where the Indians resorted in the fishing season, are now Lowell, the city of spindles and Manchester of America, which sends its cotton cloth round the globe. Even we youthful voyagers had spent a part of our lives in the village of Chelmsford, when the present city, whose bells we heard, was its obscure north district only, and the giant weaver was not yet fairly born. So old are we. So young is it. We were thus entering the state of New Hampshire on the bosom of the flood formed by the tribute of its innumerable valleys. The river was the only key which could unlock its maze, presenting its hills and valleys, its lakes and streams, in their natural order and position. The Merrimack, or Sturgeon River, is formed by the confluence of the Pemigewasset, which rises near the notch of the White Mountains, and the Winnipiseogee, which drains the lake of the same name, signifying the smile of the Great Spirit. From their junction it runs south 78 miles to Massachusetts, and thence east 35 miles to the sea. I have traced its stream from where it bubbles out of the rocks of the White Mountains above the clouds, to where it is lost amid the salt billows of the ocean on Plum Island Beach. At first it comes on murmuring to itself by the base of stately and retired mountains, through moist primitive woods whose juices it receives, where the bear still drinks it, and the cabins of settlers are far between, and there are few to cross its stream, enjoying in solitude its cascades still unknown to fame, by long ranges of mountains of Sandwich and of Squam, slumbering like tumuli of titans, with the peaks of Mushillock, the haystack, and Kearsarge reflected in its waters. Where the maple and the raspberry, those lovers of the hills, flourish amid temperate dews. Flowing long and full of meaning, but untranslatable as its name Pemiguasset, by many a pastured Pelion and Ossa, where unnamed muses haunt, tended by Oreads, Dryads, Naiads, and receiving the tribute of many an untasted Hippocrene. There are earth, air, fire, and water. Very well, this is water, and down it comes. Such water do the gods distill, and pour down every hill. For their New England men, a draught of this wild nectar bring, and I'll not taste the spring of Helicon again. Falling all the way, and yet not discouraged by the lowest fall. By the law of its birth never to become stagnant, for it has come out of the clouds, and down the sides of precipices worn in the flood, through beaver dams broke loose, not splitting but splicing and mending itself, until it found a breathing place in this low land. There is no danger now that the sun will steal it back to heaven again before it reach the sea, for it has a warrant even to recover its own dues into its bosom again with interest at every eve. It was already the water of Squam and Newfound Lake and Winnipiseogee, and White Mountain snow dissolved, on which we were floating, and Smiths and Bakers and Mad Rivers, and Nashua and Suhegan and Piscataquag, and Suncook and Socook and Kentuckok, mingled in incalculable proportions, still fluid, yellowish, restless all, with an ancient, ineradicable inclination to the sea. So it flows on down by Lowell and Haverhill, at which last place it first suffers a sea change, and a few masts betray the vicinity of the ocean. Between the towns of Amesbury and Newbury it is a broad commercial river, from a third to half a mile in width, no longer skirted with yellow and crumbling banks, but backed by high green hills and pastures, with frequent white beaches on which the fishermen draw up their nets. I have passed down this portion of the river in a steamboat, and it was a pleasant sight to watch from its deck the fishermen dragging their seines on the distant shore, as in pictures of a foreign strand. At intervals you may meet with a schooner laden with lumber, standing up to Haverhill, or else lying at anchor or aground, waiting for wind or tide, until, at last, you glide under the famous Chain Bridge, and are landed at Newburyport. Thus she who at first was poor of waters, naked of renown, having received so many fair tributaries, as was said of the fourth, doth grow the greater still, the further down, till that abounding both in power and fame, she long doth strive to give the sea her name. Or if not her name, in this case, at least the impulse of her stream. From the steeples of Newburyport you may review this river stretching far up into the country, with many a white sail glancing over it like an inland sea, and behold, as one wrote who was born on its headwaters, down out at its mouth, the dark inky main blending with the blue above. Plum Island, its sand ridges scalloping along the horizon like the sea serpent, and the distant outline broken by many a tall ship, leaning, still, against the sky. Rising at an equal height with the Connecticut, the Merrimack reaches the sea by a course only half as long, and hence has no leisure to form broad and fertile meadows, like the former, but is hurried along rapids, and down numerous falls, without long delay. The banks are generally steep and high, with a narrow interval reaching back to the hills, which is only rarely or partially overflown at present, and is much valued by the farmers. Between Chelmsford and Concord, in New Hampshire, it varies from 20 to 75 rods in width. It is probably wider than it was formerly, in many places, owing to the trees having been cut down, and the consequent wasting away of its banks. The influence of the Pawtucket Dam is felt as far up as Cromwell's Falls, and many think that the banks are being abraded and the river filled up again by this cause. Like all our rivers, it is liable to freshets, and the Pemiguasset has been known to rise 25 feet in a few hours. It is navigable for vessels of burden about 20 miles. For canal boats, by means of locks, as far as Concord in New Hampshire, about 75 miles from its mouth. And for smaller boats to Plymouth, 113 miles. A small steamboat once plied between Lowell and Nashua, before the railroad was built, and one now runs from Newburyport to Haverhill. Unfitted to some extent for the purposes of commerce by the sandbar at its mouth, see how this river was devoted from the first to the service of manufactures. Issuing from the iron region of Franconia, and flowing through still uncut forests, by inexhaustible ledges of granite, with Squam, and Winnipiseogee, and Newfound, and Massabesic lakes for its mill ponds, it falls over a succession of natural dams, where it has been offering its privileges in vain for ages, until at last the Yankee race came to improve them. Standing at its mouth, look up its sparkling stream to its source, a silver cascade which falls all the way from the White Mountains to the sea, and behold a city on each successive plateau, a busy colony of human beaver around every fall. Not to mention Newburyport and Haverhill, see Lawrence, and Lowell, and Nashua, and Manchester, and Concord, gleaming one above the other. When at length it has escaped from under the last of the factories, it has a level and unmolested passage to the sea, a mere waste water, as it were, bearing little with it but its fame. Its pleasant course revealed by the morning fog which hangs over it, and the sails of the few small vessels which transact the commerce of Haverhill and Newburyport. But its real vessels are railroad cars, and its true and main stream, flowing by an iron channel farther south, may be traced by a long line of vapor amid the hills, which no morning wind ever disperses, to where it empties into the sea at Boston. This side is the louder murmur now. Instead of the scream of a fishhawk scaring the fishes, is heard the whistle of the steam engine, arousing a country to its progress. This river too was at length discovered by the white man, trending up into the land, he knew not how far, possibly an inlet to the South Sea. Its valley, as far as the Winnipiseogee, was first surveyed in 1652. The first settlers of Massachusetts supposed that the Connecticut, in one part of its course, ran northwest, so near the Great Lake as the Indians do pass their canoes into it overland. From which lake and the hideous swamps about it, as they supposed, came all the beaver that was traded between Virginia and Canada, and the Potomac was thought to come out of or from very near it. Afterward the Connecticut came so near the course of the Merrimack that, with a little pains, they expected to divert the current of the trade into the latter river, and its profits from their Dutch neighbors into their own pockets. Unlike the Concord, the Merrimack is not a dead but a living stream, though it has less life within its waters and on its banks. It has a swift current, and, in this part of its course, a clayey bottom, almost no weeds, and comparatively few fishes. We looked down into its yellow water with the more curiosity, who were accustomed to the Nile-like blackness of the former river. Shad and alewives are taken here in their season, but salmon, though at one time more numerous than shad, are now more rare. Bass, also, are taken occasionally, but locks and dams have proved more or less destructive to the fisheries. The shad make their appearance early in May, at the same time with the blossoms of the pyrus, one of the most conspicuous early flowers, which is for this reason called the shad blossom. An insect called the shadfly also appears at the same time, covering the houses and fences. We are told that their greatest run is when the apple trees are in full blossom. The old should return in August. The young, 3 or 4 inches long, in September. These are very fond of flies. A rather picturesque and luxurious mode of fishing was formerly practiced on the Connecticut, at Bellows Falls, where a large rock divides the stream. On the steep sides of the island rock, says Belknap, hang several armchairs, fastened to ladders, and secured by a counterpoise, in which fishermen sit to catch salmon and shad with dipping nets. The remains of Indian weirs, made of large stones, are still to be seen in the Winnipesaukee, one of the headwaters of this river. It cannot but affect our philosophy favorably to be reminded of these shoals of migratory fishes, of salmon, shad, alewives, marshbankers, and others, which penetrate up the innumerable rivers of our coast in the spring, even to the interior lakes, their scales gleaming in the sun. And again, of the fry which in still greater numbers wend their way downward to the sea. And is it not pretty sport, wrote Captain John Smith, who was on this coast as early as 1614, to pull up twopence, sixpence, and 12 pence, as fast as you can haul and veer a line? And what sport doth yield a more pleasing content, and less hurt or charge, than angling with a hook, and crossing the sweet air from isle to isle, over the silent streams of a calm sea? On the sandy shore, opposite the glasshouse village in Chelmsford, at the great bend where we landed to rest us and gather a few wild plums, we discovered the Campanula rotundifolia, a new flower to us, the harebell of the poets, which is common to both hemispheres, growing close to the water. Here, in the shady branches of an apple tree on the sand, we took our nooning, where there was not a zephyr to disturb the repose of this glorious Sabbath day, and we reflected serenely on the long past and successful labors of Latona. So silent is the sessile air, that every cry and call, the hills, and dales, and forest fair, again repeats them all. The herds beneath some leafy trees, amidst the flowers they lie, the stable ships upon the seas, tend up their sails to dry. As we thus rested in the shade, or rode leisurely along, we had recourse, from time to time, to the gazetteer, which was our navigator, and from its bald natural facts extracted the pleasure of poetry. Beaver River comes in a little lower down, draining the meadows of Pelham, Windham, and Londonderry. The Scotch-Irish settlers of the latter town, according to this authority, were the first to introduce the potato into New England, as well as the manufacture of linen cloth. Everything that is printed and bound in a book contains some echo at least of the best that is in literature. Indeed, the best books have a use, like sticks and stones, which is above or beside their design, not anticipated in the preface, nor concluded in the appendix. Even Virgil's poetry serves a very different use to me today from what it did to his contemporaries. It has often an acquired and accidental value merely, proving that man is still man in the world. It is pleasant to meet with such still lines as, "Jam Leto turgent in palmite gemmy. Now the buds swell on the joyful stem." Or, "Straight adjacent passum sua queque sub arbor poma. The apples lie scattered everywhere, each under its tree." In an ancient and dead language, any recognition of living nature attracts us. These are such sentences as were written while grass grew and water ran. It is no small recommendation when a book will stand the test of mere unobstructed sunshine and daylight. What would we not give for some great poem to read now, which would be in harmony with the scenery, for if men read aright, methinks they would never read anything but poems. No history nor philosophy can supply their place. The wisest definition of poetry the poet will instantly prove false by setting aside its requisitions. We can, therefore, publish only our advertisement of it. There is no doubt that the loftiest written wisdom is either rhymed, or in some way musically measured, is, in form as well as substance, poetry. And a volume which should contain the condensed wisdom of mankind need not have one rhythmless line. Yet poetry, though the last and finest result, is a natural fruit. As naturally as the oak bears an acorn, and the vine a gourd, man bears a poem, either spoken or done. It is the chief and most memorable success, for history is but a prose narrative of poetic deeds. What else have the Hindus, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians done, that can be told? It is the simplest relation of phenomena, and describes the commonest sensations with more truth than science does, and the latter at a distance slowly mimics its style and methods. The poet sings how the blood flows in his veins. He performs his functions, and is so well that he needs such stimulus to sing only as plants to put forth leaves and blossoms. He would strive in vain to modulate the remote and transient music which he sometimes hears, since his song is a vital function like breathing, and an integral result like weight. It is not the overflowing of life but its subsidence rather, and is drawn from under the feet of the poet. It is enough if Homer but say the sun sets. He is as serene as nature, and we can hardly detect the enthusiasm of the bard. It is as if nature spoke. He presents to us the simplest pictures of human life, so the child itself can understand them, and the man must not think twice to appreciate his naturalness. Each reader discovers for himself that, with respect to the simpler features of nature, succeeding poets have done little else than copy his similes. His more memorable passages are as naturally bright as gleams of sunshine in misty weather. Nature furnishes him not only with words, but with stereotyped lines and sentences from her mint. As from the clouds appears the full moon, all shining, and then again it goes behind the shadowy clouds, so Hector at one time appeared among the foremost, and at another in the rear, commanding, and all with brass. He shone, like to the lightning of aegis-bearing Zeus. He conveys the least information, even the hour of the day, with such magnificence and vast expense of natural imagery, as if it were a message from the gods. While it was dawn, and sacred day was advancing, for that space the weapons of both flew fast, and the people fell. But when now the woodcutter was preparing his morning meal, in the recesses of the mountain, and had wearied his hands with cutting lofty trees, and satiety came to his mind, and the desire of sweet food took possession of his thoughts. Then the Danaans, by their valor, broke the phalanxes, shouting to their companions from rank to rank. When the army of the Trojans passed the night under arms, keeping watch lest the enemy should re-embark under cover of the dark, they, thinking great things, upon the neutral ground of war, sat all the night, and many fires burned for them, as when in the heavens the stars round the bright moon appear beautiful, and the air is without wind, and all the heights, and the extreme summits, and the wooded sides of the mountains appear, and from the heavens an infinite ether is diffused, and all the stars are seen, and the shepherd rejoices in his heart. So between the ships and the streams of Xanthus appeared the fires of the Trojans before Ilium. 1,000 fires burned on the plain, and by each sat 50, in the light of the blazing fire. And horses eating white barley and corn, standing by the chariots, awaited fair-throned Aurora. The white-armed goddess Juno, sent by the father of gods and men for Iris and Apollo, went down the Idaean mountains to far Olympus, as when the mind of a man, who has come over much earth, sallies forth, and he reflects with rapid thoughts, there was I, and there, and remembers many things. So swiftly the august Juno hastening flew through the air, and came to high Olympus. His scenery is always true, and not invented. He does not leap in imagination from Asia to Greece, through mid-air. Pi epsilon iota mu lambda alpha pi omicron lambda lambda mu epsilon tau alpha xi. Upsilon rho epsilon tau epsilon sigma kappa iota omicron nu tau alpha. Theta alpha lambda sigma sigma alpha tau epsilon chi epsilon sigma sigma alpha. For there are very many shady mountains and resounding seas between. If his messengers repair but to the tent of Achilles, we do not wonder how they got there, but accompany them step by step along the shore of the resounding sea. Nestor's account of the march of the Pylians against the Epeans is extremely lifelike. Then rose up to them sweet-worded Nestor, the shrill orator of the Pylians, and words sweeter than honey flowed from his tongue. This time, however, he addresses Patroclus alone. A certain river, Mineus by name, leaps seaward near to Arene, where we Pylians wait the dawn, both horse and foot. Thence with all haste we sped us on the morrow ere 'twas noonday, accoutred for the fight, even to Alpheus's sacred source, etc. We fancy that we hear the subdued murmuring of the Mineus discharging its waters into the main the livelong night, and the hollow sound of the waves breaking on the shore, until at length we are cheered at the close of a toilsome march by the gurgling fountains of Alpheus. There are few books which are fit to be remembered in our wisest hours, but the Iliad is brightest in the serenest days, and embodies still all the sunlight that fell on Asia Minor. No modern joy or ecstasy of ours can lower its height or dim its luster, but there it lies in the east of literature, as it were the earliest and latest production of the mind. The ruins of Egypt oppress and stifle us with their dust, foulness preserved in cassia and pitch, and swathed in linen. The death of that which never lived. But the rays of Greek poetry struggle down to us, and mingle with the sunbeams of the recent day. The statue of Memnon is cast down, but the shaft of the Iliad still meets the sun in his rising. Homer is gone. And where is Jove? And where the rival cities 7? His song outlives time, tower, and God, all that then was, save heaven. So too, no doubt, Homer had his Homer, and Orpheus his Orpheus, in the dim antiquity which preceded them. The mythological system of the ancients, and it is still the mythology of the moderns, the poem of mankind, interwoven so wonderfully with their astronomy, and matching in grandeur and harmony the architecture of the heavens themselves, seems to point to a time when a mightier genius inhabited the earth. But, after all, man is the great poet, and not Homer nor Shakespeare. And our language itself, and the common arts of life, are his work. Poetry is so universally true and independent of experience, that it does not need any particular biography to illustrate it, but we refer it sooner or later to some Orpheus or Linus, and after ages to the genius of humanity and the gods themselves. It would be worth the while to select our reading, for books are the society we keep. To read only the serenely true. Never statistics, nor fiction, nor news, nor reports, nor periodicals, but only great poems, and when they failed, read them again, or perchance write more. Instead of other sacrifice, we might offer up our perfect tau epsilon lambda epsilon alpha thoughts to the gods daily, in hymns or psalms. For we should be at the helm at least once a day. The whole of the day should not be daytime. There should be 1 hour, if no more, which the day did not bring forth. Scholars are wont to sell their birthright for a mess of learning. But is it necessary to know what the speculator prints, or the thoughtless study, or the idle read, the literature of the Russians and the Chinese, or even French philosophy and much of German criticism? Read the best books first, or you may not have a chance to read them at all. There are the worshippers with offerings, and the worshippers with mortifications, and again the worshippers with enthusiastic devotion. So there are those the wisdom of whose reading is their worship, men of subdued passions and severe manners. This world is not for him who doth not worship. And where, O Arjun, is there another? Certainly, we do not need to be soothed and entertained always like children. He who resorts to the easy novel, because he is languid, does no better than if he took a nap. The front aspect of great thoughts can only be enjoyed by those who stand on the side whence they arrive. Books, not which afford us a cowering enjoyment, but in which each thought is of unusual daring, such as an idle man cannot read, and a timid one would not be entertained by, which even make us dangerous to existing institutions. Such call I good books. All that are printed and bound are not books. They do not necessarily belong to letters, but are oftener to be ranked with the other luxuries and appendages of civilized life. Base wares are palmed off under 1,000 disguises. The way to trade, as a peddler once told me, is to put it right through, no matter what it is, anything that is agreed on. You groveling worldlings, you whose wisdom trades, where light ne'er shot his golden ray. By dint of able writing and pencraft, books are cunningly compiled, and have their run and success even among the learned, as if they were the result of a new man's thinking, and their birth were attended with some natural throes. But in a little while their covers fall off, for no binding will avail, and it appears that they are not books or Bibles at all. There are new and patented inventions in this shape, purporting to be for the elevation of the race, which many a pure scholar and genius who has learned to read is for a moment deceived by, and finds himself reading a horse rake, or spinning jenny, or wooden nutmeg, or oak leaf cigar, or steam power press, or kitchen range, perchance, when he was seeking serene and biblical truths. Merchants, arise, and mingle conscience with your merchandise. Paper is cheap, and authors need not now erase one book before they write another. Instead of cultivating the earth for wheat and potatoes, they cultivate literature, and fill a place in the republic of letters. Or they would fain write for fame merely, as others actually raise crops of grain to be distilled into brandy. Books are for the most part willfully and hastily written, as parts of a system, to supply a want real or imagined. Books of natural history aim commonly to be hasty schedules, or inventories of God's property, by some clerk. They do not in the least teach the divine view of nature, but the popular view, or rather the popular method of studying nature, and make haste to conduct the persevering pupil only into that dilemma where the professors always dwell. To Athens gowned he goes, and from that school returns unsped, a more instructed fool. They teach the elements really of ignorance, not of knowledge. For, to speak deliberately and in view of the highest truths, it is not easy to distinguish elementary knowledge. There is a chasm between knowledge and ignorance which the arches of science can never span. A book should contain pure discoveries, glimpses of terra firma, though by shipwrecked mariners, and not the art of navigation by those who have never been out of sight of land. They must not yield wheat and potatoes, but must themselves be the unconstrained and natural harvest of their authors' lives. What I have learned is mine. I've had my thought, and me the muses noble truths have taught. We do not learn much from learned books, but from true, sincere, human books, from frank and honest biographies. The life of a good man will hardly improve us more than the life of a freebooter, for the inevitable laws appear as plainly in the infringement as in the observance, and our lives are sustained by a nearly equal expense of virtue of some kind. The decaying tree, while yet it lives, demands sun, wind, and rain no less than the green one. It secretes sap and performs the functions of health. If we choose, we may study the alburnum only. The gnarled stump has as tender a bud as the sapling. At least let us have healthy books, a stout horse rake or a kitchen range which is not cracked. Let not the poet shed tears only for the public weal. He should be as vigorous as a sugar maple, with sap enough to maintain his own verdure, beside what runs into the troughs, and not like a vine, which being cut in the spring bears no fruit, but bleeds to death in the endeavor to heal its wounds. The poet is he that hath fat enough, like bears and marmots, to suck his claws all winter. He hibernates in this world, and feeds on his own marrow. We love to think in winter, as we walk over the snowy pastures, of those happy dreamers that lie under the sod, of dormice and all that race of dormant creatures, which have such a superfluity of life enveloped in thick folds of fur, impervious to cold. Alas! The poet too is, in one sense, a sort of dormouse gone into winter quarters of deep and serene thoughts, insensible to surrounding circumstances. His words are the relation of his oldest and finest memory, a wisdom drawn from the remotest experience. Other men lead a starved existence. Meanwhile, like hawks, that would fain keep on the wing, and trust to pick up a sparrow now and then. There are already essays and poems, the growth of this land, which are not in vain, all which, however, we could conveniently have stowed in the till of our chest. If the gods permitted their own inspiration to be breathed in vain, these might be overlooked in the crowd, but the accents of truth are as sure to be heard at last on earth as in heaven. They already seem ancient, and in some measure have lost the traces of their modern birth. Here are they who ask for that which is our whole life's light, for the perpetual, true and clear insight. I remember a few sentences which spring like the sward in its native pasture, where its roots were never disturbed, and not as if spread over a sandy embankment. Answering to the poet's prayer, let us set so just a rate on knowledge, that the world may trust the poet's sentence, and not still aver. Each art is to itself a flatterer. But, above all, in our native port, did we not frequent the peaceful games of the Lyceum, from which a new era will be dated to New England, as from the games of Greece? For if Herodotus carried his history to Olympia to read, after the cestus and the race, have we not heard such histories recited there, which since our countrymen have read, as made Greece sometimes to be forgotten? Philosophy, too, has there her grove and portico, not wholly unfrequented in these days. Lately the victor, whom all Pindars praised, has won another palm, contending with Olympian bards who sung divine ideas below, which always find us young, and always keep us so. What earth or sea, mountain or stream, or muse's spring or grove, is safe from his all-searching ardent eye, who drives off Phoebus' beaten track, visits unwonted zones, makes the gelid Hyperboreans glow, and the old polar serpent writhe, and many a Nile flow back and hide his head. That Phaeton of our day, who'd make another Milky Way, and burn the world up with his ray. By us an undisputed seer, who'd drive his flaming car so near unto our shuddering mortal sphere, disgracing all our slender worth, and scorching up the living earth, to prove his heavenly birth. The silver spokes, the golden tire, are glowing with unwonted fire, and ever nigher roll and nigher. The pins and axle melted are, the silver radii fly afar. Ah, he will spoil his father's car. Who let him have the steeds he cannot steer? Henceforth the sun will not shine for a year, and we shall Ethiops all appear. From his lips of cunning fell the thrilling Delphic oracle. And yet, sometimes, we should not mind if on our ear there fell some less of cunning, more of oracle. It is Apollo shining in your face. O rare contemporary, let us have far-off heats. Give us the subtler, the heavenlier though fleeting beauty, which passes through, and dwells not in the verse. Even pure water, which but reflects those tints which wine wears in its grain. Let epic trade winds blow, and cease this waltz of inspirations. Let us oftener feel even the gentle southwest wind upon our cheeks blowing from the Indian's heaven. What though we lose 1,000 meteors from the sky, if skyey depths, if stardust and undissolvable nebulae remain? What though we lose 1,000 wise responses of the oracle, if we may have instead some natural acres of Ionian earth? Though we know well, that is not in the power of kings, or presidents, to raise a spirit for verse that is not born thereto, nor are they born in every prince's days. Yet spite of all they sang in praise of their Eliza's reign, we have evidence that poets may be born and sing in our day, in the presidency of James K. Polk, and that the utmost powers of English rhyme were not within her peaceful reign confined. The prophecy of the poet Daniel is already how much more than fulfilled. And who in time knows whither we may vent the treasure of our tongue? To what strange shores this gain of our best glory shall be sent? In rich unknowing nations with our stores? What worlds in the yet unformed Occident may come refined with the accents that are ours? Enough has been said in these days of the charm of fluent writing. We hear it complained of some works of genius, that they have fine thoughts, but are irregular and have no flow. But even the mountain peaks in the horizon are, to the eye of science, parts of one range. We should consider that the flow of thought is more like a tidal wave than a prone river, and is the result of a celestial influence, not of any declivity in its channel. The river flows because it runs downhill, and flows the faster it descends. The reader who expects to float downstream for the whole voyage may well complain of nauseating swells and choppings of the sea when his frail shorecraft gets amidst the billows of the ocean stream, which flows as much to sun and moon as lesser streams to it. But if we would appreciate the flow that is in these books, we must expect to feel it rise from the page like an exhalation, and wash away our critical brains like burr millstones, flowing to higher levels above and behind ourselves. There is many a book which ripples on like a freshet, and flows as glibly as a millstream sucking under a causeway. And when their authors are in the full tide of their discourse, Pythagoras and Plato and Jamblichus halt beside them. Their long, stringy, slimy sentences are of that consistency that they naturally flow and run together. They read as if written for military men, for men of business. There is such a dispatch in them. Compared with these, the grave thinkers and philosophers seem not to have got their swaddling clothes off. They are slower than a Roman army in its march, the rear camping tonight where the van camped last night. The wise Jamblichus eddies and gleams like a watery slough. How many thousands never heard the name of Sidney, or of Spencer, or their books? And yet brave fellows, and presume of fame, and seem to bear down all the world with looks. The ready writer seizes the pen, and shouts, "Forward! Alamo and Fanning!" And after rolls the tide of war. The very walls and fences seem to travel. But the most rapid trot is no flow after all. And thither, reader, you and I, at least, will not follow. A perfectly healthy sentence, it is true, is extremely rare. For the most part we miss the hue and fragrance of the thought. As if we could be satisfied with the dews of the morning or evening without their colors, or the heavens without their azure. The most attractive sentences are, perhaps, not the wisest, but the surest and roundest. They are spoken firmly and conclusively, as if the speaker had a right to know what he says, and if not wise, they have at least been well learned. Sir Walter Raleigh might well be studied if only for the excellence of his style, for he is remarkable in the midst of so many masters. There is a natural emphasis in his style, like a man's tread, and a breathing space between the sentences, which the best of modern writing does not furnish. His chapters are like English parks, or say rather like a western forest, where the larger growth keeps down the underwood, and one may ride on horseback through the openings. All the distinguished writers of that period possess a greater vigor and naturalness than the more modern, for it is allowed to slander our own time, and when we read a quotation from one of them in the midst of a modern author, we seem to have come suddenly upon a greener ground, a greater depth and strength of soil. It is as if a green bough were laid across the page, and we are refreshed as by the sight of fresh grass in midwinter or early spring. You have constantly the warrant of life and experience in what you read. The little that is said is eked out by implication of the much that was done. The sentences are verdurous and blooming as evergreen and flowers, because they are rooted in fact and experience. But our false and florid sentence have only the tints of flowers without their sap or roots. All men are really most attracted by the beauty of plain speech, and they even write in a florid style in imitation of this. They prefer to be misunderstood rather than to come short of its exuberance. Hussein Effendi praised the epistolary style of Ibrahim Pasha to the French traveler Bada, because of the difficulty of understanding it. There was, he said, but one person at Jeddah, who was capable of understanding and explaining the Pasha's correspondence. A man's whole life is taxed for the least thing well done. It is its net result. Every sentence is the result of a long probation. Where shall we look for standard English? But to the words of a standard man? The word which is best said came nearest to not being spoken at all, for it is cousin to a deed which the speaker could have better done. Nay, almost it must have taken the place of a deed by some urgent necessity, even by some misfortune, so that the truest writer will be some captive knight, after all. And perhaps the fates had such a design, when, having stored Raleigh so richly with the substance of life and experience, they made him a fast prisoner, and compelled him to make his words his deeds, and transfer to his expression the emphasis and sincerity of his action. Men have a respect for scholarship and learning greatly out of proportion to the use they commonly serve. We are amused to read how Ben Jonson engaged that the dull masks with which the royal family and nobility were to be entertained should be grounded upon antiquity and solid learning. Can there be any greater reproach than an idle learning? Learn to split wood. At least, the necessity of labor and conversation with many men and things, to the scholar is rarely well remembered. Steady labor with the hands, which engrosses the attention also, is unquestionably the best method of removing palaver and sentimentality out of one's style, both of speaking and writing. If he has worked hard from morning till night, though he may have grieved that he could not be watching the train of his thoughts during that time, yet the few hasty lines which at evening record his day's experience will be more musical and true than his freest but idle fancy could have furnished. Surely the writer is to address a world of laborers, and such therefore must be his own discipline. He will not idly dance at his work who has wood to cut and cord before nightfall in the short days of winter. But every stroke will be husband, and ring soberly through the wood. And so will the strokes of that scholar's pen, which at evening record the story of the day, ring soberly, yet cheerily, on the ear of the reader, long after the echoes of his axe have died away. The scholar may be sure that he writes the tougher truth for the calluses on his palms. They give firmness to the sentence. Indeed, the mind never makes a great and successful effort without a corresponding energy of the body. We are often struck by the force and precision of style to which hard-working men, unpracticed in writing, easily attain when required to make the effort. As if plainness, and vigor, and sincerity, the ornaments of style, were better learned on the farm and in the workshop than in the schools. The sentences written by such rude hands are nervous and tough, like hardened thongs, the sinews of the deer, or the roots of the pine. As for the graces of expression, a great thought is never found in a mean dress. But though it proceed from the lips of the Wolofts, the 9 muses and the 3 graces will have conspired to clothe it in fit phrase. Its education has always been liberal, and its implied wit can endow a college. The world, which the Greeks called beauty, has been made such by being gradually divested of every ornament which was not fitted to endure. The Sibyl, speaking with inspired mouth, smileless, inanimate, and unperfumed, pierces through centuries by the power of the god. The scholar might frequently emulate the propriety and emphasis of the farmer's call to his team, and confess that if that were written it would surpass his labored sentences. Whose are the truly labored sentences? From the weak and flimsy periods of the politician and literary man, we are glad to turn even to the description of work, the simple record of the month's labor in the farmer's almanac, to restore our tone and spirits. A sentence should read as if its author, had he held a plough instead of a pen, could have drawn a furrow deep and straight to the end. The scholar requires hard and serious labor to give an impetus to his thought. He will learn to grasp the pen firmly so, and wield it gracefully and effectively, as an axe or a sword. When we consider the weak and nerveless periods of some literary men, who perchance in feet and inches come up to the standard of their race, and are not deficient in girth also, we are amazed at the immense sacrifice of thews and sinews. What? These proportions, these bones, and this their work. Hands which could have felled an ox have hewed this fragile matter which would not have tasked a lady's fingers. Can this be a stalwart man's work, who has a marrow in his back and a tendon Achilles in his heel? They who set up the blocks of Stonehenge did somewhat, if they only laid out their strength for once, and stretched themselves. Yet, after all, the truly efficient laborer will not crowd his day with work, but will saunter to his task surrounded by a wide halo of ease and leisure, and then do but what he loves best. He is anxious only about the fruitful kernels of time. Though the hen should sit all day, she could lay only one egg, and, besides, would not have picked up materials for another. Let a man take time enough for the most trivial deed, though it be but the paring of his nails. The buds swell imperceptibly, without hurry or confusion, as if the short spring days were an eternity. Then spend an age in whetting thy desire. Thou needst not hasten if thou dost stand fast. Some hours seem not to be occasion for any deed, but for resolves to draw breath in. We do not directly go about the execution of the purpose that thrills us, but shut our doors behind us and ramble with prepared mind, as if the half were already done. Our resolution is taking root or hold on the earth then, as seeds first send a shoot downward which is fed by their own albumen, ere they send one upward to the light. There is a sort of homely truth and naturalness in some books which is very rare to find, and yet looks cheap enough. There may be nothing lofty in the sentiment, or fine in the expression, but it is careless country talk. Homeliness is almost as great a merit in a book as in a house, if the reader would abide there. It is next to beauty, and a very high art. Some have this merit only. The scholar is not apt to make his most familiar experience come gracefully to the aid of his expression. Very few men can speak of nature, for instance, with any truth. They overstep her modesty, somehow or other, and confer no favor. They do not speak a good word for her. Most cry better than they speak, and you can get more nature out of them by pinching than by addressing them. The surliness with which the woodchopper speaks of his woods, handling them as indifferently as his axe, is better than the mealy-mouthed enthusiasm of the lover of nature. Better that the primrose by the river's brim be a yellow primrose, and nothing more, than that it be something less. Aubrey relates of Thomas Fuller that his was a very working head, insomuch that, walking and meditating before dinner, he would eat up a penny loaf, not knowing that he did it. His natural memory was very great, to which he added the art of memory. He would repeat to you forwards and backwards all the signs from Ludgate to Charing Cross. He says of Mr. John Hales, that he loved Canary, and was buried under an altar monument of black marble, with a too long epitaph. Of Edmund Halley, that he, at 16 could make a dial, and then, he said, he thought himself a brave fellow. Of William Holder, who wrote a book upon his curing one Popham who was deaf and dumb, he was beholding to no author. Did only consult with nature. For the most part, an author consults only with all who have written before him upon a subject, and his book is but the advice of so many. But a good book will never have been forestalled, but the topic itself will in one sense be new, and its author, by consulting with nature, will consult not only with those who have gone before, but with those who may come after. There is always room and occasion enough for a true book on any subject. As there is room for more light, the brightest day and more rays will not interfere with the first. We thus worked our way up this river, gradually adjusting our thoughts to novelties, beholding from its placid bosom a new nature and new works of men, and, as it were with increasing confidence, finding nature still habitable, genial, and propitious to us. Not following any beaten path, but the windings of the river, as ever the nearest way for us. Fortunately we had no business in this country. The Concord had rarely been a river, or rivus, but barely fluvius, or between fluvius and lacus. This Merrimack was neither rivus nor fluvius nor lacus, but rather amnus here, a gently swelling and stately rolling flood approaching the sea. We could even sympathize with its buoyant tide, going to seek its fortune in the ocean, and, anticipating the time when, being received within the plane of its freer water, It should beat the shores for banks, campoque recepta. Liberioris aquae, pro repes litora pulsant. At length we doubled a low shrubby islet, called Rabbit Island, subjected alternately to the sun and to the waves, as desolate as if it lay some leagues within the icy sea, and found ourselves in a narrower part of the river, near the sheds and yards for picking the stone known as the Chelmsford granite, which is quarried in Westford and the neighboring towns. We passed Wickasuck Island, which contains 70 acres or more, on our right, between Chelmsford and Tingsboro. This was a favorite residence of the Indians. According to the history of Dunstable, about 1663, the eldest son of Passaconaway, chief of the Pennacooks, was thrown into jail for a debt of £45, due to John Tinker, by one of his tribe, and which he had promised verbally should be paid. To relieve him from his imprisonment, his brother Wanalancet and others, who owned Wickasuck Island, sold it and paid the debt. It was, however, restored to the Indians by the General Court in 1665. After the departure of the Indians in 1683, it was granted to Jonathan Ting in payment for his services to the colony, in maintaining a garrison at his house. Ting's house stood not far from Wickasuck Falls. Gookin, who, in his epistle dedicatory to Robert Boyle, apologizes for presenting his matter clothed in a wilderness dress, says that on the breaking out of Philip's War in 1675, there were taken up by the Christian Indians and the English in Marlborough, and sent to Cambridge, 7 Indians belonging to Narragansett, Long Island, and Pequod, who had all been at work about 7 weeks with one Mr. Jonathan Ting, of Dunstable, upon Merrimack River. And, hearing of the war, they reckoned with their master, and getting their wages, conveyed themselves away without his privity, and, being afraid, marched secretly through the woods, designing to go to their own country. However, they were released soon after. Such were the hired men in those days. Ting was the first permanent settler of Dunstable, which then embraced what is now Tingsboro and many other towns. In the winter of 1675, in Philip's War, every other settler left the town, but he, says the historian of Dunstable, fortified his house. And, although obliged to send to Boston for his food, sat himself down in the midst of his savage enemies, alone, in the wilderness, to defend his home. Deeming his position an important one for the defense of the frontiers, in February 1676, he petitioned the colony for aid, humbly showing, as his petition runs, that, as he lived in the uppermost house on Merrimack River, lying open to ye enemy, yet being so seated that it is, as it were, a watch-house to the neighboring towns, he could render important service to his country if only he had some assistance. There being, he said, never an inhabitant left in the town but myself. Wherefore he requests that their honors would be pleased to order him 3 or 4 men to help garrison his said house. Which they did. But methinks that such a garrison would be weakened by the addition of a man. Make bandog thy scout watch to bark at a thief. Make courage for life, to be capitaine chief. Make trapdoor thy bulwark. Make bell to begin. Make gunstone and arrow show who is within. Thus he earned the title of first permanent settler. In 1694 a law was passed, that every settler who deserted a town for fear of the Indians should forfeit all his rights therein. But now, at any rate, as I have frequently observed, a man may desert the fertile frontier territories of truth and justice, which are the state's best lands, for fear of far more insignificant foes, without forfeiting any of his civil rights therein. Nay, townships are granted to deserters, and the general court, as I am sometimes inclined to regard it, is but a deserters' camp itself. As we rode along near the shore of Wickasuck Island, which was then covered with wood, in order to avoid the current, 2 men, who looked as if they had just run out of Lowell, where they had been waylaid by the Sabbath, meaning to go to Nashua, and who now found themselves in the strange, natural, uncultivated, and unsettled part of the globe which intervenes, full of walls and barriers, a rough and uncivil place to them, seeing our boat moving so smoothly up the stream, called out from the high bank above our heads to know if we would take them as passengers, as if this were the street they had missed, that they might sit and chat and drive away the time, and so at last find themselves in Nashua. This smooth way they much preferred. But our boat was crowded with necessary furniture, and sunk low in the water, and moreover required to be worked, for even it did not progress against the stream without effort. So we were obliged to deny them passage. As we glided away with even sweeps, while the fates scattered oil in our course, the sun now sinking behind the alders on the distant shore, we could still see them far off over the water, running along the shore and climbing over the rocks and fallen trees like insects, for they did not know any better than we that they were on an island, the unsympathizing river ever flowing in an opposite direction. Until, having reached the entrance of the island brook, which they had probably crossed upon the locks below, they found a more effectual barrier to their progress. They seemed to be learning much in a little time. They ran about like ants on a burning brand, and once more they tried the river here, and once more there, to see if water still indeed was not to be walked on, as if a new thought inspired them, and by some peculiar disposition of the limbs they could accomplish it. At length sober common sense seemed to have resumed its sway, and they concluded that what they had so long heard must be true, and resolved to ford the shallower stream. When nearly a mile distant we could see them stripping off their clothes and preparing for this experiment. Yet it seemed likely that a new dilemma would arise. They were so thoughtlessly throwing away their clothes on the wrong side of the stream, as in the case of the countryman with his corn, his fox, and his goose, which had to be transported one at a time. Whether they got safely through, or went round by the locks, we never learned. We could not help being struck by the seeming, though innocent indifference of nature to these men's necessities, while elsewhere she was equally serving others. Like a true benefactress, the secret of her service is unchangeableness. Thus is the busiest merchant, though within sight of his Lowell, put to pilgrim's shifts, and soon comes to staff and scrip and scallop shell. We, too, who held the middle of the stream, came near experiencing a pilgrim's fate, being tempted to pursue what seemed a sturgeon or larger fish. For we remembered that this was the Sturgeon River, its dark and monstrous back alternately rising and sinking in midstream. We kept falling behind, but the fish kept his back well out, and did not dive, and seemed to prefer to swim against the stream, so, at any rate, he would not escape us by going out to sea. At length, having got as near as was convenient, and looking out not to get a blow from his tail, now the bow-gunner delivered his charge, while the stern man held his ground. But the halibut-skinned monster, in one of these swift-gliding pregnant moments, without ever ceasing his bobbing up and down, saw fit, without a chuckle or other prelude, to proclaim himself a huge imprisoned spar, placed there as a buoy, to warn sailors of sunken rocks. So, each casting some blame upon the other, we withdrew quickly to safer waters. The scene-shifter saw fit here to close the drama of this day, without regard to any unities which we mortals prize. Whether it might have proved tragedy, or comedy, or tragicomedy, or pastoral, we cannot tell. This Sunday ended by the going down of the sun, leaving us still on the waves. But they who are on the water enjoy a longer and brighter twilight than they who are on the land. For here the water, as well as the atmosphere, absorbs and reflects the light, and some of the day seems to have sunk down into the waves. The light gradually forsook the deep water, as well as the deeper air, and the gloaming came to the fishes as well as to us, and more dim and gloomy to them, whose day is a perpetual twilight, though sufficiently bright for their weak and watery eyes. Vespers had already rung in many a dim and watery chapel down below, where the shadows of the weeds were extended in length over the sandy floor. The vespertinal pout had already begun to flit on leathern fin, and the finny gossips withdrew from the fluvial street to creeks and coves, and other private haunts, excepting a few of stronger fin, which anchored in the stream, stemming the tide even in their dreams. Meanwhile, like a dark evening cloud, we were wafted over the cope of their sky, deepening the shadows on their deluged fields. Having reached a retired part of the river where it spread out to 60 rods in width, we pitched our tent on the east side, in Tingsboro, just above some patches of the beach plum, which was now nearly ripe, where the sloping bank was a sufficient pillow, and with the bustle of sailors making the land, we transferred such stores as were required from boat to tent, and hung a lantern to the tent pole, and so our house was ready, with a buffalo spread on the grass, and a blanket for our covering our bed was soon made. A fire crackled merrily before the entrance, so near that we could tend it without stepping abroad, and when we had supped, we put out the blaze, and closed the door, and with the semblance of domestic comfort, sat up to read the gazetteer, to learn our latitude and longitude, and write the journal of the voyage, or listen to the wind and the rippling of the river till sleep overtook us. There we lay under an oak on the bank of the stream, near to some farmer's cornfield, getting sleep, and forgetting where we were. A great blessing, that we are obliged to forget our enterprises every 12 hours. Minks, muskrats, meadow mice, woodchucks, squirrels, skunks, rabbits, foxes, and weasels, all inhabit near, but keep very close while you are there. The river sucking and eddying away all night down toward the marts and the seaboard, a great wash and freshet, and no small enterprise to reflect on. Instead of the Scythian vastness of the Billerica night, and its wild musical sounds, we were kept awake by the boisterous sport of some Irish laborers on the railroad, wafted to us over the water, still unwearied and unresting on this 7th day, who would not have done with whirling up and down the track with ever-increasing velocity and still reviving shouts, till late in the night. One sailor was visited in his dreams this night by the evil destinies, and all those powers that are hostile to human life, which constrain and oppress the minds of men, and make their path seem difficult and narrow, and beset with dangers, so that the most innocent and worthy enterprises appear insolent and attempting of fate, and the gods go not with us. But the other happily passed a serene and even ambrosial or immortal night, and his sleep was dreamless, or only the atmosphere of pleasant dreams remained, a happy natural sleep until the morning. And his cheerful spirit soothed and reassured his brother, for whenever they meet, the good genius is sure to prevail.